phones and everything.
Exactly.
So I would say let's start now. I mean, we have really good weather in Germany, so there are not a lot of people live, but we have many people who subscribe for to basically receive the recording. So it's going to be an interesting show for everybody, I would say. And I am super curious, and I will tell you in a second why. Topic of this podcast or webinar is how to start your B2B podcast series. And we want to learn from Logan and his the B2B Growth Show that has over 4 million downloads and over 1,600 episodes. So super stoked to be to have you on our show here. And I honestly listen to your podcast weekly. So thanks a lot for joining us, Logan.
Oh, thanks so much for listening to the show, Sammy. Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, I like to say we've been podcasting before podcasting was cool again. You know, the last 2 years, podcasting has really exploded in kind of a second wave. The first wave of podcasting was pre-iPhone, right? And it was different. You had to, sync iTunes on your desktop and move it over to your iPod and those sorts of things. And so now podcasting has kind of gone through this resurgence. Obviously, as we look for more passive content, people are consuming more audio in both podcasts and audiobooks and that sort of stuff. So it's a fun place to be in right now, and excited to share, what we've learned in launching over 100 podcasts at this point with everybody here.
Awesome. So before we start, maybe a short introduction about the host of the show, which is Savu, the company I am managing partner at. So we help B2B companies win leads through LinkedIn with a very personalized and individualized approach. And well, now I would like to learn something about you and Sweetfish Media. So tell me how when did you join Sweetfish, which is the company of the B2B Growth Show? And how did you come to podcasting?
Yeah, so I was actually a listener of the B2B Growth Show, which is our daily B2B marketing podcast for Sweetfish Media. So Sweetfish, we are a podcast agency for B2B brands. So we produce podcasts exclusively for companies that sell business to business. We don't do kind of the mass market consumer podcasts. And B2B Growth is the flagship show that Sweetfish produces for our own brand. But before I was part of Sweetfish, I had been about 10 years into my B2B sales career, and I started listening to podcasts because I was doing a lot of driving. I was in outside sales and had a lot of what I call windshield time in the car. And I started listening to James, the founder of Sweetfish, and the team on the B2B Growth Show, and listening to sales and marketing content there, became a fan, got on the email list, and actually became friends with James. I was looking at starting my own marketing agency with a friend, and I reached out to James to pick his brain about his entrepreneurship journey, and he kindly obliged. And that venture I was thinking about didn't work out, but my friendship with James did. And it was about a year after I met him that I joined Sweetfish, and I stepped into two roles: the host of our podcast, which is why I've got the podcast mic in front of me, and you see the mic flag with B2B Growth right in front of me here, and director of partnerships for Sweetfish. So basically, I head up sales for Sweetfish, and we'll talk a little bit more about our podcasting strategy, but just a little prelude there. There's a reason that I head up sales for our agency, and I'm also the primary co-host of our podcast, because we see podcasts as a way to not only generate reach, but help you build relationships. So it's a marketing and a sales tool. And the short answer to your earlier question, Sammy, I've been with Sweetfish for about 2 years now, and we've been on a phenomenal growth path. I joined as full-timer number 4, and today we're over 25 people. We just hired 3 new producers.
Wow.
So we've been very fortunate as podcastings continue to grow, and we've kind of evolved our service with all the things that we've learned with each new podcast we launch. I feel like we learn something new.
Amazing. So before we deep dive into all the technical and specific information about podcasting, I want to find out some more about yourself. So tell us something that none of your coworkers know about you.
Well, I would say all my coworkers know this, but not all my LinkedIn friends really know this. My coworkers know it because I'm the one who's always turning the text messages from blue to green. So I'm a diehard Android guy. And I don't know about your neck of the woods, Sammy, but here in the States, most of the people I work with are iPhone users. And for a number of different reasons, I've always been a big Google fan. And so I've got my Google Pixel 2, and I'm always making everybody a little bit grumpy when I turn the text messages green. What's it like there? Is there that same sort of stigma for the one Android user in the group, Sammy, or is it more split between Android and iOS in Germany?
I think most people I know use iOS, honestly.
Yeah.
So I never heard of this. Interesting, interesting. So let's start. How did Sweetfish Media get into podcasting?
Yeah, so this actually ties into that strategy that I mentioned earlier, where podcasting is not only a marketing tool but a sales tool. So about 5 years ago, James founded the company after a few other potential startups, and Sweetfish Media was actually started as a blog writing agency. And we landed our first customer, which was a nonprofit. It was actually a church plant in Texas, here in the States. And as most early stage companies go, whether you're a SaaS business or a service-based business, what do, Sammy? You find that one customer and you're like, how can I find more that look like this one? Right. And so
Exactly.
James, as the founder, was thinking that. Now he's a very charismatic guy. He's a well-spoken guy. He's been the host of the podcast forever. He does a lot of speaking, but he hates cold calling. He doesn't like cold outreach. He doesn't like doing that. He just doesn't have, what I would say is a sales bone in his body, if you will. And so he said, well, I don't want to cold call all these people, but I know this ideal customer profile that I want to go after. And he had done some passion projects with a friend. I think he had started a podcast called Inspiring Awesome. You can probably still find it on Apple Podcasts somewhere. No new episodes in a while. But he said, well, what if we started a podcast for these church leaders and these nonprofit leaders, and I invited my prospects to be a guest on this new podcast? I'll get to talk shop with them. We'll create some content, and I'll maybe generate some relationships where there might be an opportunity to talk business. And the thing that really surprised him, he queued up 100 emails, 100 email addresses of prospects he had identified that fit that new persona or that new profile, and 80 people responded and said, yes, Sammy. And you guys do outreach via LinkedIn, right? And any channel. Where was the last time you saw an 80% reply rate on any sort of outreach campaign?
Never, honestly.
It doesn't happen, right? Now the bad news was none of those nonprofits had budget for the blog writing that we wanted to offer. So it was at that point where we said, well, B2B companies know specifically who they're trying to reach. You usually know what is the company profile, what's the title, right? And so since you know very narrowly who that is, and an interview-based podcast needs a guest, instead of focusing on industry thought leaders and authors and speakers to have on your podcast to try and reach the audience over here, what if you just go straight to the audience and say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. potential customer, I'd like to have you as a guest on our podcast. You still create content. You can still slice and dice that and use it in your inbound marketing strategy. But even if no one ever finds that content, that guest of your podcast could end up doing business with you, or they might refer you to a friend who is also, fits your ideal buyer persona. So it was that light bulb moment that caused us to pivot into podcasting specifically for B2B brands.
Now that's really amazing what you're saying. So to sum it up, basically, even if no one attends your podcast, you have at least this one-to-one relationship with the guest of your podcast. And you spend some time, I can tell us. So you have a call before we will deep dive later, but before the podcast, you'll have some time with the guest before. You'll have the podcast, you maybe have a debrief. So you develop a personal relationship, and this is valuable. And this goes a little bit against this whole, I would say, automation age, which was maybe between 2000 and 2020, where everybody and everything was trying to automate on scale. And you're going on, no, I don't have to reach 10,000 people. I pick one, and this is my ideal customer, and I spend time with this person and develop a relationship. So I really like what you're doing here. And it obviously seems to work, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been with the company now 2 years, and as you said, we're 1,600 episodes into our podcast. So we are seeing the long-term inbound marketing effects of a podcast now as people listen and find interest, find out about Sweetfish, develop interest, and reach out to us. But our podcast guests over the last 2 years, we've had as much business come from podcast guest relationships as we have from listeners coming inbound to us. And we've put a name to the strategy now. We call it content-based networking. Our founder James has now written a book, and that's the title of it, Content-Based Networking. And I just posted on LinkedIn today. We think that content-based networking is always going to give you better results than just content marketing, because it gives you all the same benefits of content marketing. If Sammy, you fit my ideal customer profile, I invite you on our podcast. We have a great conversation. Like you said, you and I, there could be something that happens from that one-to-one relationship that maps to revenue for the business. But I'm still going to take that podcast and I'm still going to publish it. And I'm maybe going to turn it into a written post on LinkedIn, and I'm maybe going to take a video clip of it. I can, share that to my email list. I'm still doing content marketing. We're not saying don't do content marketing. We're just saying layer on this networking aspect of content-based networking while you're doing your content marketing. I see it as really a cheat code, because it allows you to play the long game and the short game, because we know that inbound and content marketing, it takes time. It takes time to build a brand. And while you're doing that, instead of just kind of hacking away at a blog post and hoping that it gets seen by a prospect in a year, right? Go directly to someone. And now you can do content-based networking with a podcast. You can do it with a webinar. You can do it with video series if you have a YouTube channel. So if you already have a channel where you're producing content, I would say try to use content-based networking. Invite potential customers in to be a guest or a speaker or a contributor. Invite them in to be part of the content collaboration, not just a potential consumer of the content.
Yeah, I think it's smart in two ways. First of all, as you said, it's a potential lead, but the person you invite as a guest. But second, this person speaks the language of your potential customers. So it's not like some high-level professor or thought leader who's like flying like 10 miles above everyone else and almost no one understands him or her. It's like from the people for the people, so to say. So they really understand what he's talking about. They have the same issues, and maybe this person has a solution for the issues, and they trust that person. So that's really clever. I like it a lot. And while we're at that topic, let me ask you, how do you get in touch with potential guests? How do you do it? What would be your advice?
Yeah, I would say most people are very, very surprised, Sammy, how often people say yes, even if it's a new show or a new podcast. And I think really the trick to this, if there is a trick, is to not try to justify it, not try to add credibility where there isn't credibility. So for instance, Sammy, if you and the team started a new podcast, you might be tempted to say, hey, so-and-so, we're starting a new podcast, and it's going to be about this, and we don't have any listeners yet, but we're going to do this and this, and put together this growing long, email that becomes a big, long PR pitch. And it looks like a PR pitch. And I get a lot of those, and I don't ever read them because they're too long. So I would say keep your outreach short. Create a curiosity gap. You don't have to answer all the questions that you think the person is going to ask. You want to get them to ask that question, because once they're engaged, you guys see this in the LinkedIn outreach you do, right? When you create a curiosity gap, instead of trying to answer all the questions, they come to you. Now they're engaged. Now that back and forth is where the magic happens, and you convert them to the next step, whether you're trying to book a meeting or secure a podcast guest. And then the other tip I would say is make it all about them. Right? So Sammy, if I'm reaching out to you, I'd say, hey, we love to feature emerging entrepreneurs and great business leaders like yourself to talk about what you're struggling with and the solutions that you're coming up with. Up for being our guest? And literally, those 2 or 3 sentences that I just spouted off could be your entire first email. Now, you want a second and third, maybe a fourth email to drip out, that you can use SalesLoft or Outreach or one of those tools, or maybe, a more affordable one like Woodpecker or Mailshake. Very easy to set up, kind of an automated sequence. To keep that outreach very, very brief and make it all about them, because your podcast, if you're going to use this content-based networking strategy, you don't want it to be all about your expertise and your brand. You want it to be all about the practitioners that you serve and their day-to-day. And so if you have a show that's all about, whether you serve lawyers or marketers at SaaS companies, how do you make it all about them so that they can talk about their day-to-day, whether that relates directly to your product or service? Because then, as you said, Sammy, it's going to create content that their peers want to consume and learn from, and they're going to say yes. So, for instance, we could have the Sweetfish Media podcast, but no one's searching for Sweetfish Media, right? We could have the B2B podcasting podcast, but then I couldn't invite you, Sammy, and say, hey, you guys want to be a guest on our show about podcasting? And you're like, well, we haven't done a podcast before. I don't have anything to say about it. But if I say, hey, Sammy, come on the B2B growth show, you're like, oh, I'd love to talk about how we're achieving growth at our company. And B2B is a highly searched term in Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all of those. And so when you shine the spotlight on the practitioners you serve rather than your own brand, you're going to get more guests and you're going to get more listeners. So I kind of went into the listeners, but I think the way that we approach podcast guest outreach also helps you attract more listeners as it does guests as well. So
awesome, thanks a lot. And you directly dived into the question that I had lined up: how to brand your podcast, and you already answered that one. It's basically, it's not about yourself, it's about the people you invite and the target group you have in mind. So thinking about them and thinking about maybe the value that you bring to that you want to bring to the target group. So you don't do podcasts for the sake of podcasting. You help others to create a good podcast in order to help them grow. So B2B growth is a logical name of the show. Makes absolutely sense. Let me take 1 second. I just want to add, and that's something I forgot, and thank you for our assistant who told me right now. You can ask questions here. So you can ask questions. There's a chat. There's a question section here. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. And we try to either I'll either get them in at this moment if they fit, or we'll have a short Q&A at the end. So let's get back into it. So the next question that I have is, and I don't know if there's a perfect answer for that one, but how often should you podcast? Is there a minimum, or is there something where you say that's where you have the most, get the most out of it?
Yeah, I would say, you have to take this with a grain of salt because we're a podcast agency, and it's, in our best interest to tell our customers that the more you do, the more results you will see. But as I mentioned before, we've launched over 100 shows. We've had our show active for over 4 years. And today we actively manage 60 to 70 podcasts, all in the B2B space. And the ones that are growing the most are more frequent. They're not doing an episode a month or a couple a quarter. They are, one, they're consistent and they're more frequent. We see weekly as really that tipping point where weekly or greater, you see much more results than if you're doing, once every other week or once a fortnight, as my Australian customers like to say, or once a month or less frequently. Now, if you need to start out with every other week to make it manageable, but you're interviewing potential customers, then you work that angle until, you get into a rhythm and you're ROI positive on the podcast, and then you double down and you go to weekly. But there's a couple of reasons I think weekly is the tipping point. Podcasting is just such a serial medium. People subscribe and they tend to stay subscribed, and they tend to look forward to, I'm going to hear Sammy on Thursday when they drop an episode. And so the more that you can take advantage of that, also the more that you can stay in front of folks, we talked a little bit about the explosion of podcasts in the last 2 years. And I hear it all the time where people are like, oh, there's too many podcasts. There's too many marketing podcasts. There's too many entrepreneurship podcasts. The fact of the matter is there's about 1 million podcasts active in Apple Podcasts right now. And that seems like a big number, but not when you compare it to the 40 million YouTube channels and the billions and billions of blogs. And no one's saying, well, it's too late to have a blog, right? So by comparison, podcasting is actually very, very unsaturated when you compare that 1 million number to the much higher numbers of other channels. And also when you look at that 1 million, there are a lot of those that aren't active because the far majority of podcasts don't last. And then when you look at the smaller portion that is active, they're not very frequent. And then the ones that are, also, there are some that aren't consistent. They might go every week for a while and then they stop. And so if you can be frequent and consistent, even just weekly, and it's not like you have to show up the same time every week, it's on-demand content. You can batch 4 at the beginning of the month and schedule them out to release every Thursday. Mm-hmm. If you can do that, then there's actually a lot of greenfield opportunity for you to reach an audience. And like we said, the guest relationships being a benefit as well. There's still a massive opportunity for folks that are diving in. I was just listening to a marketing podcast last night, and he said, we're up to 2,000-3,000 subscribers, and B2B marketing is a very saturated place for all sorts of content. People producing content about content and all these sorts of things. And he said, I could have said that, there wasn't room for another marketing podcast. So that was a good example. And that was actually just a show I listened to, not one that we produce. So that's, a tale from out there in the wild, not just me kind of advocating for podcasts.
No, absolutely. And I mean, on top of that, you usually have a very, very narrow target group. So it's not everybody, it's a very narrow target group with a specific problem where you want to brand your podcast around. So, and then if you look at these podcasts that post frequently, like once a week, there's probably not many anymore left in this space. And then you bring something unique to the table. And I think it's always worth a try. As you said, you never know until you try, and it's not as saturated as all the other channels. And a lot of companies invest a lot of money in other channels. Why not try it with the podcast? So one question that popped up right now, because I thought about what you said, and right now I'm the only one producing content. And I thought, oh, I would love to have it weekly, but I cannot manage that by myself. How did you solve this problem?
Yeah, so there are a couple of ways you can do this. So one, batch creating your content. Because sometimes, we see this with some of our customers, Sammy, where they say, man, we really want our CEO to be the podcast host. He has the industry knowledge, he has the connections, he has the charisma, but the CEO also has the least amount of time of anybody as well. And for a lot of the marketing leaders I talk to, they agree with me when I say it's probably easier to get your CEO for 4 hours one morning, the first Friday of the month, than it is to get him or her for 30-minute chunks or 45-minute chunks, once a week. And they're like, yeah, absolutely. So I think batching really helps. You can also, do a mixture. I talked about B2B growth not being the B2B podcasting podcast. Now, B2B growth is all about B2B marketing, and podcasting fits within that. So in addition to interviewing customers and prospects, occasionally we'll do a how to podcast episode, a how to on podcasting, and talk directly about, what we're learning from launching shows and things like that, just like the content we're sharing here. And those, I don't need an outside guest. I could hop on and do a solo episode. And so batching, mixing up your episode types, those two things can really help you get ahead of the game and build a queue of potential episodes to release, so that you're not having to record and release every single week and no one's hair's on fire.
We got one question that fits right in, so I just read it. It's from Daniel, I think. Yeah, Daniel. How do you come up with new topics every week? And what kind of creative process is behind that?
Yeah, so this is something that we've been thinking a lot about. Early in our podcast, we were admittedly kind of very cavalier about this. We would say, hey, Sammy, you want to come on the podcast? And as soon as you say yes, we'd say, great, we talk anything B2B marketing. What do you want to talk about? Now, when you're talking to marketers, oftentimes they can come up with content, right, pretty quickly because it's what they do. But you might not sell to marketers. You might sell to IT folks or entrepreneurs or CEOs or HR leaders. But we firmly believe that everybody has content that can be helpful for their peers. It's the things that they talk about, I'd say over the water cooler. Here in the US, it's over Zoom lately, but it's the things that they talk to their peers about. So we've actually developed a process that we call POV discovery, or point of view discovery. And what we do with most of our guests now is we block 30 minutes to 45 minutes for the actual interview. But before we do that, we have a short 15-minute prep call with the guest. And we ask some repeatable questions. And these can work, again, whether your guest is in marketing or sales or HR or manufacturing or whatever the case is. One of the questions that we ask there would be, Sammy, what's a commonly held belief in B2B sales that you passionately disagree with? Now, I can see the smile on your face. You're starting to think through, yeah, I know the last argument I had about, about such and such on sales, or this on LinkedIn. Asking that sort of question in a prep call can find where's the passion and where's the expertise of your guest where they really have something new to offer. Another question could be, again, I'll use you as kind of my guinea pig, Sammy. Sammy, what's something that your team has tried in the last quarter that you were surprised by the results, either, positive or negative? And now I find a story that's important to you and likely important to your peers that you learned from, either something new you tried that worked, or even better, a failure story that others can learn from if you can get the guest comfortable with sharing that. But oftentimes the failure stories are really where great content happens. Another way to ask that would be, Sammy, what's something that you and your team have recently accomplished that you're very proud of? Now, you have to be careful with that, because then your guest could kind of go on the PR pitch of their company and their product and those sorts of things. But you can kind of guide them to talk about something that would be useful and helpful for their peers. So those sorts of opening questions in the point of view discovery process can allow you to crowdsource the content from the people that you're interviewing, because again, if they fit the same persona, they're sitting in the same seats as the listeners you're trying to reach. If they care about it, their peers likely care about it too.
Yeah, that's really great. And it's an easy process. Huh? So you first look for the perfect customer, so to say, in your target group, which represents your target group. Then you have your common 2 to 3 questions, and there are probably some more that you can ask or think about. And then you get valuable insights. And that's important, I think, where your guests are really passionate about. So it's not just they tell a story and you hear it in their voice and you see it, they're just telling it because, okay, you asked them to, but it's something that they really deeply care about. And that's what I like also, for example, about your show. You really see that every time you it's like magic. If you ignite that spark in people, you can transport emotions via podcast even. And that's nice. That's nice.
That's really well said, Sammy. One of our writers, so as we produce podcasts for other companies, part of what we do is then slice and dice that into micro content or long form written content, like a blog post or a micro video or a LinkedIn post. And one of our writers told me the other day, when he's listening to podcast episodes to turn it into additional written content, he's listening for when does the inflection of the guest's voice go up. When like, even if I listen to it at 2x, right, you can hear, ooh, they kind of got fired up there. All right, that's probably where we want to dig in and pull out that micro video clip or something like that. So you're exactly right. It creates more engaging content. And then I'll just kind of, I don't want to camp out here too much, but for anybody that's like, okay, well, then what, right? I find out Sammy's kind of differentiated point of view. Now I need to ask some questions. I need to actually go through that. The way that you can do that in a repeatable way, but that is customized for each one, is just think like a journalist. Think what, why, and how. So you actually usually start with the why. So like Sammy, if you said, people are trying to over automate in B2B sales, and that's why you're, something you're really passionate about. My why question would be, well, why are you so passionate about this? Da, 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 da. Why do you think people are doing it this way? And why aren't they doing it differently? Da, da, da. Okay. Well, what does it look like and what sort of results when people over automate? Okay. And in each one of these, there could be a follow-up question, or if you don't have anything to follow up and you've kind of tapped out the why, you move on to the what. And then most importantly, you always want to make sure you have room for the how. So if we were talking about over automation in sales, Sammy, I could be like, well, how have some of your customers solved this problem? What has it looked like when they've changed? What sort of changes could they make? Now, you want to make sure your guest doesn't always say, well, they hire us or they buy our product. So you kind of tease that out in the pre-interview call to make sure they have some hows that are going to be actionable. And then you just start to have empathy for your listener. If I were listening to this, what follow-up question would I ask? If they say, well, there are a number of different ways you can do that, for example, right? Like that being the host to me is way easier than being the guest, because then I just have to lead you along, Sammy. I just say, well, what's an example of that? And if you kind of dance around it, is there anywhere that, you've seen that in the last week? And you just, kind of make sure you bring that guest down into the weeds, which is, again, getting into the weeds, getting into the specific tactics is going to be where you create actionable content for the rest of your audience. And that POV discovery and then the what, why, how framework, thinking like a journalist, just gives you a framework to start on. And then you just hone your skills over time as an interviewer.
So you got better over time.
I'm trying real hard.
No, that gives me some hope. Huh? But I can also say I really am directly in the shoes of our listeners, because we also want to start a podcast. So I can directly relate and ask all the questions that I want to have an answer to anyway. So one thing I would like to know now is when you have your guest on your show, and this is a potential customer, how do you make the switch to you're just a guest to, hey, we could also talk about what's your problem, maybe we have a solution for that. So how do you turn them into a potential prospect?
Yeah, so I actually got a really good tip from a friend of mine, Dylan Hay. He runs Hay Digital, which is a PPC marketing agency out of the UK. And he has a podcast and he invites B2B marketing leaders at SaaS companies, which are his ideal customer profile, to be guests on his show. And he always asks a recurring question towards the end of the show that is geared towards, what's one of your biggest challenges in marketing right now that you're trying to solve for? Now, that could be something not related to pay-per-click campaigns or PPC, which is where Dylan and his team actually specialize. It might be around, we're trying to develop thought leadership, or we're trying to create more content for LinkedIn, or we're trying to figure out, attribution, whatever it is. But if he, in that trigger question that is going to be helpful for the audience, Dylan now has a way to strike up a conversation. If he says, well, we're trying to get our cost per click down on these paid ad campaigns, then it would be very natural in one or two conversations later for Dylan to say, hey, I know you probably know we hope in this area, would a discovery call make sense? You can make that switch without it feeling, bait and switch or like free lunch for the timeshare presentation sort of thing. If you bake in those trigger questions, one of the ways that it's happened for me as well, I might have a guest on our podcast and they're talking about, they're trying to take an account-based approach. Well, post-interview, it would be very logical for me to say, hey, I know you guys are trying to figure out how to go after more specific target accounts. That's where we help with this podcast strategy and this thing we call content-based networking. I don't want this to feel like a pitch though. So if that's like way out of left field, feel free to tell me to take a hike. And I qualify it that way and make it very, very apparent that, hey, they can tell me no, absolutely. And it's not, so it's a little bit more art than science. You kind of have to pick your points, but those are a couple of examples of how you can make that turn. And quite frequently, not only in our experience, but a lot of our customers, they found that they're having that post-interview conversation, and they might be having it with a marketing leader who, isn't responsible for booking meetings. They're not the salesperson, but they ask the marketing leader, hey, can I get a demo of your product? Because they've just spent 30 to 45 minutes, possibly 2 calls, getting to know them, talking shop. and they know the person who is the host, and they have some relationship with the brand. And so oftentimes people will ask you, and it's definitely happened to me as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think, funny enough, I have to share this now. I I watch a TV series right now from time to time just to relax a little bit. It's called Lucifer. I don't know if you know that one. And it's about basically the devil visiting Earth, and the devil is not as bad as you might think, but he has some powers. And one of his superpowers is he can ask you what's your deepest desire, and then people ask honestly what the deepest desire is, and he uses this to create really good relationships with everybody. So everybody loves Lucifer. Why? Because he can tickle out the deepest desire, and he can basically help you achieve this desire. And this is exactly what you're doing with this final question. It's always personalized, the answer. And if you can help by yourself, you can help by yourself. And if you know someone who could help, you still build a good relationship, and you can basically bring two people together where you provide value. And hey, maybe it's not a sale right now, but you're on top of mind, basically. And
Yes, absolutely. I love what you said there, because, Sammy, with some of our guests, they might say, oh, we're trying to figure this out, or we're trying to redesign our website. Website redesign is not something we do at Sweetfish, but I know people, because we're active in the B2B marketing space, who do pay-per-click campaigns or do website. And so I'm always looking for, where can I add value? I'm not always looking, where can I throw that right hook and make the sales pitch, but where can I help? And if I take the same approach, whether it's us at Sweetfish that can help, or someone that I know that can help, or a podcast I can recommend, or a blog post that I read that would be applicable to what they're thinking about, that's really what's top of mind for me after that interview and those first few interactions. How can I help? And I think when you do that, people, just the law of reciprocity kicks in. People start to see you as someone who adds value, and they want to come to you for your expertise, because through the course of it, they're going to find out what you do. They're going to, be aware of it. So you don't have to come with a hard sales pitch. And to me, I've been using this methodology of selling for the last 2 years. For the previous 10, I was doing it the old way: outbound email, outbound cold calls. Hey, Sammy, I know you don't want to get a pitch, but I think I can help at some point. Can I get 15 minutes on your calendar? And it has truly changed the trajectory and the way I think about my sales career in the last 2 years, approaching it this way. And that's why I just love what you just said about, how can I add value? How can I help? And that might be our company, and I won't apologize for that. I'll make it very easy for them to say no, but I'll also be very, very quick to offer help that has nothing to do with business for my company.
Yeah, it's an attitude, basically. If you have this attitude, I think it's the attitude of the century, or not century, decade, you say, decade. Where going away from this pushing and back to, hey, I can offer help, and people think about you in this way. And I received, and that very surely also happened to you. I didn't have some people as a customer directly, but they referred me in the end to someone else who has this problem. So it's a magic bullet, so to say, and it's always adding value. We just have a comment from Purvi. I just read it. I initiated a podcast, the Wisdom Workshop. I hardly ask questions and give the whole space to the interviewee. I think this is also very important. Whenever I want to share my thoughts on a specific topic, I record a podcast with me only.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And it goes back to that mixing up the episode formats we were talking about earlier. You don't have to only have a solo episode podcast. You don't only have to have a guest-based podcast. You don't always only have to have one guest, right? And that's where having that framework, knowing where the guest wants to talk about it and just where you want to lead them. As the host, I've listened to podcasts where the hosts obviously want to hear themselves talk more than the interviewee, and it's not a good experience for the listener, and it's not a good experience for the guest. And so I love that approach of letting the guest have the spotlight, because as you shine the spotlight on them, you're actually getting that benefit back to you and your brand. The more that you try to shine the spotlight on yourself, the more people just say, oh, I don't want to see that. But when you have something very specific to offer, go to that solo episode, record a quick 5-minute, like what we would do is, hey, we've heard we've launched 5 podcasts this past month, and we saw this hang up in all 5 of these launches. And we want to share it with you. If you're, looking at working with us, or if you're trying to launch your own podcast, learn from these mistakes that we learned this past month. That would be a great solo episode for us to put out rather than having a guest on. So pick your points and mix it up. And it also adds some variety to your content. So I love that comment there.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Povi. So one question that I also ask myself, okay, I understand how to get the podcast guest. I understand how to record it. It's not that complicated. We have an idea on how to repurpose content, but it's not necessary in the beginning. But now I have some podcasts recorded. How do I get it out into the world? And how do I market it then?
LinkedIn. LinkedIn should be your primary focus. I don't care what persona you sell to. When it comes to social media, there are content-rich, content-saturated channels, and there are unsaturated channels, meaning are there more consumers of content than there are content creators, like YouTube? There's more content being created on YouTube than can be consumed. On LinkedIn, there's a very, very small percentage of the daily active users who are actually producing and sharing original content themselves. And that's why, I could go on Twitter right now and post something, and I would be ecstatic if I got 100 views of that tweet. On LinkedIn, I'd be really disappointed if I only got 1,000 views of a post. And I've seen 5, 10, even 50,000 views of an organic post on LinkedIn. And I'm no Gary Vee. I'm no Seth Godin. I'm no big name. So LinkedIn, social media channels change. If someone's listening to this recording, 5 years down the line or 2 years down the line, it may completely be gone. But right now in the fall of 2020, LinkedIn is the best place to generate more organic reach. Now, when you do that, Sammy, it's very natural to think, where should I promote the podcast? Let's see, there's a question here. Is it necessary to be a premium member? I would say no. The premium membership gives you more access to who's viewed your profile, some in-mail messages. I don't send in-mail messages. They get a far lower response rate than personalized connection requests and then direct messages. Sammy's the LinkedIn expert here, so I'm assuming that I'm saying something good because he's nodding. So you could just get on, start posting natively. And there are 2 content types that work really well on LinkedIn natively: text posts and short video clips. Now, the video might be a higher lift, but LinkedIn is actually different than Instagram and Facebook. Posts with images and posts with links actually do much worse on LinkedIn organically. I think that's because LinkedIn is kind of known to be the place for more meaty, more rich business content. And so write a 100-word post on LinkedIn. Don't put a link in the post. Just make it valuable in and of itself. And that ties back to what I was going to say. I had a post on LinkedIn the other day that said, stop promoting your podcast on LinkedIn and start repurposing your content for LinkedIn. Now, when you do the latter, you actually are promoting your show and gaining more. So for instance, what most people do on LinkedIn is say, hey, I just did a great podcast episode with Sammy. We talked about the 3 things that are going to help you, increase reply rates on LinkedIn messages. Click the link. What we would do instead is say, like, Sammy, let's say you shared 3 tips to improve your reply rates. I would actually share them, not tease the content and make someone click through and listen to the episode when all they're trying to do is scroll LinkedIn and find something good. You're asking them to switch channels and just teasing them because you want the click through and you want the subscriber. Now, the opposite would be then actually share those 3 tips, put the link to the podcast episode in the first comment, and naturally you will pick up a few people clicking through. It might be a lower percentage because you're not putting it right in their face, but the post is going to be viewed many more times. And I'd rather have a post be viewed 2,000 times and pick up, 3 subscribers than it be viewed, 50 times and pick up 1 subscriber. It's a higher rate, but really I want to build trust with my audience on LinkedIn, because then they'll say, well, Logan is delivering value here on LinkedIn. I should listen to his podcast because he's probably delivering value over there. Sammy, would you say that, you know, the people that you follow and the content that you engage with on LinkedIn and your own habits as a consumer, like the advice I'm giving here, does it fit with you as a consumer on LinkedIn?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to give the value now, and everything else seems a little bit like they want to scam me somehow. They want to have my email address. They want to spam me with stuff, and I just want to have some help. And what you say is absolutely true. And I have some two questions, follow-up questions. But what I like a lot is that that you as Logan are posting something. So it's not only the B2B growth show LinkedIn page that is posting something, or the Sweetfish media page that is posting something. It's you, Logan, who did the interview, who's posting something. And one of our core beliefs is that people connect to people. So in the end, you do the podcast and you take a snippet out of it. People already listen to your voice or see your face if you also record the video with it. And so they basically have a personal relationship with you without knowing you. So I can tell you, it's so weird, and I don't know if I should say it now, but it was like, I was feeling almost like a groupie before our first call. I thought, hey, that's Logan. Like, I listen to this guy like almost every week. And then I hear your voice and it sounds like I know you, you know? And that is like an amazing, like, personal connection you can build without knowing someone. So repurposing content and using also your own LinkedIn page to promote it is awesome. One question I have is, where does the link go that you put in? So do you link to the LinkedIn page? Do you link to your web page of the B2B Growth Show, where you have all the channels like Spotify and, or, I don't know, iTunes?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple ways you can do this. The way that we do it and the way that I recommend it for what it's worth is every episode of your show should have a post on your website, whether it's a full blog post or if it's just the player for the episode and the links in all the podcast players and maybe a little graphic that, hey, we interviewed Sammy on episode 1625 and here's the headline. That can be pretty simple to do. So I would drive people back to your website for two reasons. It benefits them because you don't know if they listen in Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, whatever the case is. You can drive them there and then provide all the links, as opposed to taking the links in the comment on LinkedIn and giving them all 5 options every time, which isn't clean for them and it's more work for you. So push them back there. Since you're driving them to an owned asset, if you're doing any sort of retargeting ads, you can then share additional content through those retargeting ads, or you might have an email pop up. Now, I'm not a big fan of a slider here and a pop-up here and another lead capture form here, but you could say, hey, want to get, a weekly email with our top tips from the podcast? That could be a way for you to not only drive them to potentially subscribe to the podcast, but now get them into your email database. Again, you don't want to make the hard turn and just start spamming them. Are you ready to buy? Do you want to buy our product? Do you want to have a discovery call? Come on, Sammy. But there is power in driving them back to an owned asset, giving them the options of where they want to listen and subscribe, and then, having them go down another trail within your nurture sequences via email or retargeting ads.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for that one. So Frauke is listening. She's responsible for the whole repurposing and marketing. We will definitely do everything you said. So we come to the end now of our show. And before we basically have our 1-2 last questions, I want to ask the audience, if you have any more questions, ask them now. Because this is the last chance you can talk to Logan directly, at least in this show. And we have one question here. Frauke already answered, but the question was, Sandy has a poor network. Will we basically also make the recording available? Yes, we will. So we will post it on the LinkedIn page that you subscribe to the show, or to this podcast specifically, and you will have a link where you can basically listen to the whole podcast. We will add some value in the sense that we will basically put in all the questions that we asked and point you to the right minute where you basically can listen to it. So we add a lot of value here.
Sammy, I saw another one in the Q&A about the software toolkit and the equipment to get started if you're just getting started. So I'll definitely take that one. It's a common one. This is one that gets a lot of people really tripped up. You can host a new podcast on Anchor for free, anchor.fm, anchor.fm. They have a process you can follow to then get your podcast listed in all the different directories like Apple and Google and Spotify. The mic that I have in front of me, it looks fairly fancy, but all of the equipment I have in front of me here is less than $300 between the mic and the shock mount and the boom arm. Oftentimes and the mic itself is less than $100, and it connects via USB. So that's where you could go. If you don't have that, a noise canceling headset, or if you don't have that, wired headphones with the mic, go old school, forget the AirPods. Those wired headphones with a dynamic mic actually are really good at isolating the sound, just like a podcast mic. If I talk over here, you can't hear me as well as if I'm talking right in front of the mic where it's picking up the most sound. As far as recording, there are some great podcast options out there like Zencaster and Ringer. We actually recommend two to our customers. Zoom is phenomenal. Even though it's not built for podcasting, there are a few drawbacks when it comes to the audio and video quality, but just it's so easy for people to join Zoom these days. If 9-year-olds and 90-year-olds can get on Zoom, then most of your guests can probably get on Zoom, and it allows you to very easily record audio and video. And we're big fans of not only the audio only podcast, but the video clips. Another good one that does a really good job of capturing audio and video, higher quality than Zoom. It's not as well known as Zoom, but easy for guests to get in, is one called Riverside. Riverside.fm is one I'd highly suggest folks to look at. So also, if anyone, I know we'll share kind of next steps and stuff like that in a bit. But if you send me a direct message on LinkedIn, I can share with you the exact elements on Amazon that you can get in this setup that you see right in front of me. Not the cool mic flag, but you can get one of those if you're a customer. I'm just kidding.
No, perfect. That would have been my next question. So how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so they can either email me directly, Logan@sweetfishmedia.com, Logan, or they can look me up on LinkedIn. Let me know that you heard me on the webinar with Sammy. Pretty easy to find on LinkedIn, Logan, Logan, Lyles, Lyles. Feel free to send me a connection request. Let me know you heard me on the webinar with Sammy. And if you want to get that list of audio gear, just shoot me a message there and be happy to reply with that Amazon list we've got saved and make it really easy for anybody looking for that or any other follow-up questions.
Awesome. And if you would be willing to also share this list with us, we can directly post it on the LinkedIn page with the link to your LinkedIn profile so that you can provide value and basically get some more people that directly probably have very interesting questions for you. So we come to an end now and we are in time. That is amazing.
Always good.
So, so I must say we learned a lot. I learned a lot. And we will take your advice in producing our own podcast show now for our company. We already have a name. We just have to reserve it. So I will not promote it right now, but it will come. And we will stay in touch for sure, Logan. And I really can encourage everybody who's in B2B and is responsible for marketing or sales to follow your show. So it's the B2B Growth Show. If you type it in on LinkedIn, you should find it directly. Or if you use Spotify or all the other channels, it's, I think is it correct what I just said? The B2B Growth Show?
Yeah, if you search B2B growth in any podcast player, you should be able to find it. You can also go to sweetfishmedia.com. Right on the homepage there, one of our only pieces of gated content is our 26-step guide to launch a podcast. It'll pop up if you're on the page for more than 10 seconds or so. That could be a great resource for folks. And also on our homepage, you'll find less about our service and more content to follow. And B2B Growth is the top show on that page. But if you're looking for content on sales or specific to another industry, you may be able to find another podcast that could give you value there just on the homepage on sweetfishmedia.com.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. So this is the end. Thanks a lot for everybody who participated live, and see you in our next show. And Logan